The Nintendo Entertainment System, probably my favorite system of all time, and home to some of the very best action platformers ever made. We're all familiar with the heavy hitters such as the amazing Castlevania series, the nearly impossible to beat Ninja Gaiden, and of course my favorite, the Blue Bomber, Mega Man. But lately the attention has turned to other great platformers considered to be hidden gems. Games like Power Blade, Shatterhand, Metal Storm, and a game I have already covered, Vice Project Doom. Let's be honest, these games are no longer secrets and are finally getting the attention they deserve. But what about those other games that aren't quite on that level but are still extremely good? Today I want to talk about a game that isn't a masterpiece, but it's definitely one you should try. KickMaster on the NES.
Remember all those great games we used to play growing up in the 80s and 90s? Most of them are sitting in an attic or garage somewhere, doing nothing but gathering dust. My opinion is, we should give them another look.
KickMaster was released by Taito in 1992. For a game released in that era with that name, you would automatically assume it featured some of the stars of the silver screen like Steven Seagal, Chuck Norris, or JCVD, Jean-Claude Van Damme. Actually, it would be pretty cool to see a Jean-Claude Van Damme game, but KickMaster is a mythical tale featuring a princess, sorcery, and what else? Kicking! In KickMaster, the Kingdom of Laurel is attacked and burned by monsters sent by the evil sorceress Belzed. During the attack, the king and queen are killed, and the princess Sylph, their only child, and heir to the kingdom, is kidnapped. You play as the martial artist Thonolin, whose brother was killed in an attempt to rescue the princess. With his dying breath, he pleads for Thonolin to use his emerging kicking skills to avenge him, rescue the princess, and save the kingdom. It's your classic good versus evil fairy tale story that's based around kicking. What more could you ask for? Well, a game that's fun to play. KickMaster is a side-scrolling action platformer where attacks are focused on a variety of kicks. Yeah, kicks, so that it's basically the opposite of Shatterhand, where your attacks are based solely on punching. A game where the only attack is a kick can get boring easily, but the game actually employs a level system where the higher your level, the wider your variety of kicking attacks is, but we will come back to that later. You also have magical attacks that you can use to aid your quest. The magic abilities are learned by picking up magical relics throughout the levels. Each time you use a magical attack, it reduces your MP. However, you can replenish your MP and hit points by collecting power-ups that explode out of your enemies when you kick them. I wasn't joking, they literally fly out of the enemy on impact, and you have to stop, jump, and try to collect them. This design really irritates me, and slows down the game, which is a gripe I have had with another great NES game, G.I. Joe, which has a similar design, and this won't be the last time I mention G.I. Joe in this review. Outside of that small issue, KickMaster is a very solid game, with intuitive controls that is just a blast to play. The new kicking techniques you learn as you progress are easy to perform surprisingly on a controller with just 2 buttons. Who knew kicking, just kicking, could be so much fun? As your repertoire of moves increases, you really do become a badass. Maybe even as bad as Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Now take your big stick and your boyfriend and find a bus to catch.
Well, no one is as bad as JCVD. Nobody.
It is extremely hard to explain the visual presentation of KickMaster. The game at times can be simply beautiful, rivaling the graphics on some of the most beautiful games on the system. The fantasy element of the game is really well depicted through the art style and really makes the game stand out. Where this game falters is in the extremely puzzling choices of colors used at times. The dark pinks, purples, and greens do not mesh well, and you are left with something that certainly isn't aesthetically pleasing. On top of that, they use a flash effect at times that, coupled with the color palette, is close to seizure-inducing.
No, I'm okay, I swear.
Wait a minute, this art style is very familiar to another one of my favorite NES games, G.I. Joe. I mentioned earlier G.I. Joe shared another similarity with KickMaster. Well, it should be no surprise they were developed by the same company, KID, Kindle Imagine Develop, who made some other good games for the NES worth checking out. I don't really have a lot to say about the music. It's good and it fits both the theme of the game and the level design very well and enhances the experience. But you don't leave the game humming the tunes like with other fantastic NES soundtracks. So really the music is good, does what it's supposed to do, but just isn't memorable or iconic.
Graphically, this is an extremely beautiful game, but the colors sometimes can make it a little difficult to look at. Speaking of difficult, this can be a challenging game.
Platformers on the NES have a known reputation of being extremely difficult. KickMaster is no different in providing that challenge to players, but it is a rewarding instance where the challenge isn't unreasonable. Outside of the classic pitfall of getting knocked backwards when an enemy hits you. Seriously, why was this put into so many games, and why are you always next to a pit when it is unavoidable to get hit? As the game progresses, the enemies get more and more difficult to take down, and it can seem a little unbalanced at times. This is where the game's action RPG element comes into play, as you can level up your character, which not only broadens your moveset, but also increases your hit points and magic points, which certainly makes the game's challenge more reasonable, and honestly, necessary towards the end of the game. Another aspect I really like is the game has a password system, so you don't necessarily need to beat it in one sitting. Thankfully, the password system is pretty simple, and a lot of other games on the system could have learned from it.
KickMaster has all the elements to classify it as a good game, but for an action platformer to be truly memorable for me, a lot hinges on its boss battles.
All great NES games have those boss fights we agonize over. But before we get there, KickMaster also features some very cool sub-bosses as well in some levels. Later in the game, some levels feature even more than one sub-boss. The sub-boss fights are unique and fun, and could be level bosses in their own right compared to other great NES games. The bosses themselves are really cool and often feature gigantic screen-filling sprites that are very well drawn. Each of the bosses have specific patterns of attack that you will need to learn and counter to beat them. If you aren't the patient type, this is the appropriate time to use your magic to restore your health or attack the boss. After each boss battle, you will receive a new magical relic to aid you in your quest going forward. Honestly, I didn't need to use the magic at all until the last level. Stage 8 not only features two sub-bosses that are really end-stage bosses, but also right before you face the final boss, you go through a marathon fight against 4 knights that transform back and forth into more difficult versions of various enemies throughout the game. If you survive that carnage, you finally face the sorceress Belzed. Belzed can pose a great challenge, but if you have any MP left, you can freeze her with the Earthquake spell. Then it's time to kick the shit out of her.
Oh yeah, time to put this witch on ice. I've done it! I've killed the sorceress, rescued the princess, and saved the kingdom. There is just no better feeling. Well, at least in regards to playing games. So that's KickMaster on the NES, another example of 8-bit platforming greatness, and a game I'm suggesting you should definitely check out. Thank you everyone so very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the game.